Hi, my name is Dr. Jonathan Guist, Professor of Clarinet at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Today we're going to be talking about the 2020-21 TMEA All-State Audition Etudes for Soprano Clarinet. I hope you find this useful as you go through your preparations. The first etude, number 36 from the Rose 40 Studies, is all about style. I like to think of this etude as being in a very light, bouncy style throughout. The key to achieving this is articulation and air support. Let's begin by talking about the eighth notes in measure 1. These should be played with space between each note and a little bounce that moves the music forward. To create the space, I use teet for my articulation syllable. The note begins when you remove your tongue from the reed and ends when you return the tongue to the reed to stop the sound. Be sure to support your air from your stomach at all times and don't let the air stop between the notes. To create some forward direction and bounce, I use my stomach muscles to add a very slight extra push of the air on each note. It is very easy to allow the staccato eighth notes to sound very dry and hard. Think about contacting the reed with only one single taste bud on the tip of your tongue, and be sure that the tongue is making that contact right on the tip of the reed. Emphasize the roundness of your embouchure by reinforcing forward corners, thinking ooh, which will help you prevent you from biting and make it easier to keep resonance in the tone on the short notes. All of these things will apply to all of the articulated eighth notes that occur throughout this etude. The next thing we need to discuss in terms of articulation is making a difference between the 16th notes that are marked staccato underneath a slur and those that don't have any marking at all. I always interpret staccato under a slur to mean articulated with a light legato style. For these, I think D, D, D. As always with articulation, air support from the stomach is key, so be sure the airstream is moving fast through the 16ths as you tongue. For the unmarked 16th notes, I use a T syllable to go for a more defined start to the note and create just the slightest bit of space. Let's move on to some of the more challenging technical passages. The main technical feature in this etude are the octave 16th notes. It is very important to start very, very slowly with these. Make sure you pick a tempo that is slow enough for you to play it perfectly without any mistakes, and then very gradually speed up the tempo from there. If you're interested in a complete guide on how to practice technique in technical spots like this, pause your video for a second and scan this QR code. This will take you to my practice guide, which you are welcome to download. If you don't have a QR scanner, you can also go to my website, www.jonathangeist.com, to download a copy. Now, back to those octave 16ths. Like I said before, start very slowly. At this slow tempo, take the time to pay attention to your hand and finger position and make sure everything is in the right place. You want to keep your fingers curved and close to the keys as you play these passages. The other thing that is very important through these passages is maintaining a consistently focused tone. This is where voicing comes in. Voicing concerns the shape of our tongue while we're playing. When we play the clarinet, we want to be sure we are always maintaining a high back arched tongue position, kind of like that. We create this tongue position by saying the word key and holding on to the E sound of that word. It is very important to practice using this voicing on everything you play. To help make sure you do this on the octave 16ths, you need to articulate every two-note slur with a T syllable and maintain the E sound through the second note of each pair. So your articulation pattern through these passages would just be T, 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 like this. I'm working there to keep everything exactly the same. The air is consistently supported from the stomach, the tongue is maintaining its voicing and matching the articulation each time, and the only thing changing as I play through the pattern are my fingers. Notice also how the embouchure stays set. By keeping everything set and consistent, you are allowing the clarinet to function properly, and this will make your life much, much easier. Think of this saying, change notes with your fingers, not with your mouth and not with your air. To check yourself, slowly play only the upper notes in these patterns with good voicing and listen to the quality of the tone. Then, when you go back to playing the octaves, be sure the tone on the upper notes matches what you just heard when playing them by themselves. If it doesn't, Then go back and keep working on maintaining that high back E tongue position throughout, and then check yourself again. Finally, let's talk a little bit about the trills and grace notes. At the goal tempo of dotted quarter equals 60 to 68, I think one trill is just fine. I like to think of the trill and the two grace notes as one single 5-note pattern that I can practice by itself to make sure I can play smoothly and evenly. Then I incorporate it back into the music. For the A to B grace notes in measures 30, 45, and places like that, and for the 32nd notes like in measure 49, I use the top side key with the right index finger. Hold the A key down and just add the side key to play the B. In all cases, these grace notes and trills should not interrupt the primary rhythm. You can start out by playing these measures without them until you feel like you've established a good rhythmic foundation, and then add the trills and the grace notes, making sure you are still hearing the primary rhythm the same way. It may be helpful to record yourself and listen back if you're not sure. Speaking of recording, this is a great tool to use when you practice. Sometimes when we're just listening while we're playing, we don't hear everything. Take the time to record passages as you work on them to make sure what you think you're hearing is what's actually coming through. You may discover your articulations aren't matching, or that you can't hear every individual 16th note in a pattern, or maybe you're not playing with as much dynamics as you think you are. Recording yourself reveals all, and will make your end result much, much better in the long run. Etude number 2, number 32 from the Rose 40 studies, is the slow etude. This is your chance to show off beautiful tone, expressive phrasing, and a broad range of dynamics. But before we talk about all of those things, let's start with another very important aspect of this etude, rhythm. While the time signature for this etude is 4/4, the tempo is quite slow. Counting in 4 with the quarter note getting the beat can be tricky at such a slow tempo. Some of the more complex rhythms, such as the 32nd notes or the 16th note triplets, can be difficult to feel exactly in time when counting in a slow 4. For that reason, I recommend counting this etude in 8 beats per measure, where the 8th note gets the beat. Here are a couple of examples of how you would do that. Let's first look at measure 1. If we're giving the 8th note the beat, the opening half note now gets 4 counts, because there are 4 eighth notes in one half note. The quarter note gets 2 counts, because there are 2 eighth notes in a quarter note, and the 16th notes each receive half a beat. So counting that first measure would go like this. Let me start a metronome. So here's measure 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and. Okay, pretty straightforward with that first measure. Now let's look at something a little more complicated. Let's look at measure 23. The half note is easy. We count that just like we did in measure 1. So let's look at the 16th note triplets. Each 3-note group here happens during the space of 1/8 note, or 1 beat, like this. 5 la-li, 6 la-li, 7 la-li. Okay? So now we're just left with the 32nd notes at the end of the measure. How many beats do these 4 notes cover? Well, let's do some math. We're counting in 8, so we have 8 beats in a measure. We've already used up 7 beats with the half note and the 16th note triplets. So that leaves only beat 8 for the 32nd notes. There are 4 notes, so we count those just like we would normally count 16th notes. 8 e and or 8 ta te ta, depending on what you like to use. So the whole measure together goes like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 la-li, 6 la-li, 7 la-li, 8 e and Okay? Might be a little bit tricky at first, and it will take some practice to get comfortable with it. Don't be afraid to write in the counts to help you. Be sure you're always working with the metronome to keep your pulse nice and steady. Accurate rhythm is very important, and counting the etude like this will be well worth the time and effort to make sure that your rhythm is spot on. Once you've mastered the rhythm counting in 8, I recommend transitioning back to that slow 4 to help you play with a greater sense of connection and phrase and broaden things out. Work with your metronome in 4 for a while until you feel comfortable, and then start to play without the metronome to establish a good sense of internal pulse. This is also where you can add in a little push and pull in some carefully chosen places to create a nice musical effect. Now, let's talk a bit about playing with a beautiful tone throughout. The most important ingredient in a great tone is air. Not only do you need to use a lot of air, but it must be the right kind of air as well. What do I mean by the right kind? Well, when we play clarinet, we have to use what I like to call low air. This means when we take a breath, we have to be sure we are breathing all the way to the bottom of our lungs. One way to make sure we do this is to think about expanding around our midsection whenever we take a breath. Let's try something. See if you can make yourself yawn. Did you feel that? When you yawn, where did the air go? We breathe very deeply and our stomach expands. The air goes all the way to the bottom of our lungs. This is the same kind of breath we want to take when we play the clarinet. Now, place your hand on your stomach over your belly button, and let's do that on purpose, taking a deep yawn-type breath. You should have felt your stomach push your hand out when you did that. This is a good way to practice making sure you feel the right kind of breath. Another way to think about it is to get fat with air every time you breathe and expand all the way around your stomach, your sides, all the way around to your back. Make sure you're keeping your shoulders and your upper chest relaxed and just concentrate on making yourself fat. Now that we've discussed getting a good breath, we have to now get that air out and into the clarinet, and we want to make sure we're doing that the right way. We need to use our stomach muscles to support the airstream. So when you play on the clarinet, think about using those stomach muscles to stay fat as you play. Push out and down into your chair to move the air with power and speed. You'll want to work to maintain this stomach support at all times. When you first start experimenting with this, start with some very basic long tones so you can have all of your focus be only on the air. Then start applying it to scales and other simple patterns. Once you feel like you have the hang of it, start applying it to everything you play, especially this etude. The other ingredient to playing with a beautiful tone throughout is your voicing. We discussed this already when we were talking about etude number 1, and all of those same ideas apply here as well. Remember, we want to work to maintain that E tongue position, the high back arched tongue position, saying the word key, and maintaining that E shape 100% of the time. Listen to yourself very carefully and make sure your tone is consistently full, focused, and clear on every single note. We get this by the right combination of that good low air supported from the stomach and proper voicing. Pay special attention to the throat tones, which is the range from open G to the B flat above that. You will want to add extra fingers to these notes to give them extra resonance. You can start by just putting your right hand down. To get more advanced, experiment with different finger combinations to create specific resonance fingerings for each note. For example, when I play open G, I like to add the first and third fingers in my right hand. When I play throat A, I add the second and third fingers of my left hand and the right hand E, B key. There are a lot of different options here, but it's worth it to take the time to figure out what works best for you and your clarinet. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this etude is phrasing. Good phrasing is essential for you to create an expressive and musical performance. Each phrase will have shape that builds a sense of tension as it leads to the point of the phrase where that tension then releases and shapes back down to the end of the phrase. The markings provided in your music can serve as a good guide for this. Controlling from your stomach muscles, use your airspeed and dynamics to show this shape. You'll have to exaggerate everything much more than you think for it to be clear to your listener. Let's use the opening phrase to discuss some ways to work on these elements. In measure 1, this phrase builds towards the F sharp on the downbeat of measure 2. So starting at the beginning of the first measure, you will use your stomach muscles to speed up the air, creating a crescendo that goes from the start all the way to that F sharp on the downbeat of measure 2. From this point, keep controlling your airspeed from your stomach to maintain a good tone as you let the air slow down so that the sound decrescendos to the E quarter note. Be sure the end of the E has a nice taper to it into the rest. The shape needs to start right at the very beginning of the first note. There's nothing more uninteresting than a long note that has no shape, so don't fall into this trap. Practice the shape of the phrase by first playing it only on one pitch. Let's use the starting B and play the shape while we count the rhythm in our heads but without changing notes, like this. This gives us a chance to practice how we want to use our stomach muscles to move our air, speeding up the air to create the crescendo and then letting the air slow down to create the decrescendo. Once we're comfortable with this, then we can go back and do it again, playing all of the correct notes as written, but concentrating on creating that exact same shape with our air. Always keep in mind, the air creates the shape, while only your fingers change the notes. Go through this etude phrase by phrase, repeating this process until you are satisfied that you have a good idea about the shapes you want to create throughout the whole piece. Again, recording yourself will be very useful here. If you can clearly hear your dynamics and phrase shapes on the recording, then you are doing enough. If not, you need to go back and practice doing more and more and more. I like to exaggerate like crazy when I'm doing this. And then it becomes a little bit easier to then tone it down a little bit to get just the shape that I'm looking for. third and final etude, number 24 from the Rose 32 Etudes, is a lot of fun and goes by quickly, but don't be too eager to crank up that speed just yet. Just like I mentioned with the first etude, start very slowly. Find that tempo where you can play without any mistakes and work it up from there. When you're at this very slow tempo, start paying attention to your hand and finger position. Control this and keep everything in place right from the start and work to maintain everything in place as you increase the tempo. Articulation again plays a large role in this etude. There are two basic types of articulation that I use here. The first is for repeated 16th notes as in measures 1 and 2. For these I keep the articulation light, but don't worry about playing super short. Use a T syllable and use a very fast airstream that moves in a forward direction. It is important to keep the air steady with a consistent support all the way through each phrase in order to properly support the articulation. Good articulation is actually just as much about the air as it is the tongue. This fast, constant airstream will ensure that the various intervals speak immediately and clearly and the reed responds properly to your tongue. The second type of articulation that we use in this etude is a clipped staccato. In addition to where staccato is specifically marked, for the sake of musical consistency, I like to apply this style of articulation to all of the scalar and arpeggiated articulation patterns, reserving the first non-staccato style only for the patterns with repeated notes like I already discussed. We first use this clipped staccato style in measures 3 and 4. To play staccato, we use a teat syllable, just like we discussed in Etude 1, starting the note by releasing the tongue from the reed and ending the note by immediately returning the tongue to the reed to stop the sound. The air, however, does not stop. Here's how this works, and it's a nice exercise you can use to work on this. Use an open G. Start the sound, stop the sound with your tongue, keeping the air moving, and then release to start the sound, stop the sound, release over and over again. Could you hear the air continuing even when the sound had stopped? My tongue is on the reed, but just lightly enough to stop the vibrations of the reed, not so strongly that I'm closing the reed against the mouthpiece. That's an important part of this too. Then you gradually make the note shorter and shorter and shorter until you get to a staccato. So there at the end, I was playing a staccato, my tongue was coming off the reed and immediately going back, creating that clipped staccato style while the air was going all the time. It takes time and practice to develop this skill, but is very important. We then apply this style of articulation to the staccato notes in this etude. The other important part of the clipped articulation style comes when we have slurred notes followed directly by staccatos. The word staccato means separated, so to get the proper style we must create space both before and after the note. This means we have to clip the end of the slur to create the necessary space before the staccato. We do this by stopping the sound with the tongue, just like when we end the staccato note itself. Remember, keep the air going, like this. This is measure 3. Now, when we play the first 4 measures together, we hear the 2 different styles and how they contrast with each other. Okay, so these 2 concepts of articulation apply to the entire etude. The only other thing to be aware of from an articulation standpoint is to be sure when playing the slur 2 patterns, we keep both notes equal in length. The tendency is often to cut the second slur note short. When followed by a staccato like we just talked about, that's okay, but when followed by another slur, keep the articulation legato and connected. Now let's turn to a technical issue. There are several places where you are asked to slur from a lower note up to the B flat above the staff. These are great places to use your 1-in-1 B flat fingering. First finger in the left hand, first finger in the right hand. The first time this comes up, we slur from an F up to the B flat like this. much simpler using the 1-in-1. This makes the technique in these spots much easier and smoother. Sometimes the 1-in-1 fingering doesn't want to speak. If this is the case for you, it can often be fixed by just slightly realigning your bridge key in one direction or the other. Try this and see if it works. Most likely it will, but if it still doesn't speak for you, that means your clarinet might need to be adjusted by either your band director or a repair person. Now that we've addressed these concepts, the rest is just about practice. As I mentioned with Etude number 1, always be sure you start very slowly. So slow that there is no possible way you can make a mistake. Then, using your metronome, gradually speed things up. There are other practice techniques such as using practice rhythms and something called chunking that are also very, very helpful. Again, I invite you to download my practice guide for a detailed practice routine that includes all of these things, and when followed faithfully is guaranteed to get the job done. As you prepare for this year's auditions, put the focus on the process and getting a little better each day. If you do that, the results you want will surely follow. Best of luck to all of you, and even though things look a little different this year, I encourage you to take this opportunity to improve yourself as a clarinetist and musician and take your shot at being the best you can be. If you have any questions about anything I talked about here or anything else clarinet related, feel free to get in touch by emailing me at jonathan.guist@utrgv.edu. I also invite you to follow @UTRGV Clarinet on Instagram and Facebook to stay up to date on news and events of the UTRGV Clarinet Studio. Thanks for watching and happy practicing!